The great hall of Sinbad's mansion was once again filled with his friends and the porter, Sinbad, all eager to hear the continuation of his adventures. Sinbad, seated on a plush divan, looked around at their expectant faces and smiled. "You no doubt wonder," he began, his voice taking on a reflective tone, "how, after being shipwrecked 5 times and escaping so many terrible dangers, the rock, the giants, the serpents, and the old man of the sea, I could resolve again to tempt fortune and expose myself to new hardships. I am myself astonished at my conduct when I reflect upon it. It seems I was possessed by a restless spirit, a destiny that would not let me sit still. For a year after my 5th voyage, I rested in Baghdad. I enjoyed the company of my friends, the comforts of my home, and the pleasures of the city. But slowly, the familiar itch returned. The quiet life began to feel dull. I longed for the open sea, the thrill of discovery, and the challenge of trade in distant lands. Despite the earnest entreaties of my kindred and friends, who did all in their power to dissuade me, reminding me of the perils I had barely survived, I prepared for a 6th voyage. Instead of taking my usual route via the Persian Gulf at Basra, I decided to travel overland first. I joined a large caravan and traveled once more through several provinces of Persia and the Indies, trading along the way. Finally, I arrived at a distant and bustling seaport, a city I had never visited before. There, I found a large merchant ship whose captain was bound on a long, ambitious voyage to the farthest reaches of the East. The prospect excited me, and I embarked with my goods. The voyage was long indeed, much longer than any of us anticipated. We sailed for weeks, then months across a vast and unfamiliar ocean. The weather was often unkind, and the captain and pilot, though experienced, lost their course in these strange waters. We sailed on, hoping to find a familiar landmark, but the sea remained an endless expanse of blue. At last, after many trials, they discovered where they were, but we had no reason to rejoice at the circumstance. We saw the captain quit his post at the helm, uttering loud lamentations. His face was pale with terror. He threw off his turban in despair, pulled at his beard, and beat his head with his fists like a madman. Alarmed, we crowded around him and asked the reason for his despair. He pointed with a trembling finger to the horizon. "We are lost," he cried. "We are in the most dangerous place in all the ocean. A rapid and irresistible current has caught the ship. It carries us along with it, faster and faster, and we shall all perish in less than a quarter of an hour. There is nothing I can do. Pray to God to deliver us from this peril, for only He can save us now." At these words, panic spread through the ship. The crew scrambled to lower the sails, hoping to slow our progress, but the force of the wind and the current was too great. All the ropes broke with loud snaps, and the sails flapped uselessly. The ship was carried by the current with frightening speed straight towards a dark, imposing shape on the horizon. It was an inaccessible mountain that rose sheer from the sea, its cliffs towering hundreds of feet into the air. At its foot was a narrow, rocky beach. The current drove us relentlessly towards it. We braced ourselves for impact. With a sickening crunch that threw us all off our feet, the ship struck the jagged rocks at the base of the mountain. The hull was shattered, and the vessel began to break to pieces almost instantly. It was a miracle that any of us survived. The ship broke up in such a manner that the part where I and several others were standing was thrown onto the rocks. We scrambled onto the narrow beach, bruised and terrified, but alive. We managed to salvage some provisions and the best of our goods that washed ashore from the wreck before the sea swallowed everything else. When the initial shock had passed, we looked at our surroundings. We were trapped on a narrow strip of land at the foot of a towering cliff that was impossible to climb. The ocean churned violently in front of us, the current that had brought us here now forming a barrier to our escape. The captain, who had also survived, looked at us with bleak eyes. "God has done what pleased him," he said solemnly. "We have been spared the sea only to face a slower death here. Each of us may as well prepare his mind for the end, for we are all in so fatal a place that no one shipwrecked here has ever returned to their homes." His discourse afflicted us sensibly. We embraced each other, weeping and bewailing our deplorable lot. The mountain at the foot of which we were wrecked formed part of the coast of a very large, uninhabited island. As we explored the beach, we found grim evidence of those who had come before us. The shore was covered with the rotting timbers of countless wrecks, with the sun-bleached bones of unfortunate mariners, and with a vast quantity of precious goods and riches that lay scattered and useless on the sand. Gold, silver, spices, and jewels, all worthless to men facing starvation. The geography of the place was truly unique and terrifying. In all other places I have seen, rivers run from their channels on land down into the sea. But here, a large river of fresh water ran out of the sea and flowed inland into a dark, gaping cavern at the base of the mountain, whose entrance was very high and spacious. The current that had destroyed us was fed by this strange river. What was most remarkable in this place, and a cruel irony given our situation, was its incredible wealth. The very stones of the mountain were made of crystal, rubies, and other precious stones, glittering in the sun. Here is also a sort of fountain of pitch or bitumen that runs into the sea, which the fish swallow and turn into ambergris. This the waves throw up on the beach in great quantities. Trees also grow here, most of which are wood of aloes, equal in goodness to those of the famous Isle of Comari. We were surrounded by a king's ransom, yet we would gladly have exchanged it all for a simple loaf of bread or a way to escape. To finish the description of this place, which may well be called a gulf of no return, it is not possible for ships to get off when once they approach within a certain distance. If they be driven thither by a wind from the sea, the wind and the current impel them onto the rocks. And if they come into it when a land wind blows, which might otherwise help them escape, the sheer height of the mountain stops the wind and occasions a dead calm, so that the force of the current carries them ashore regardless. And what completes the misfortune is that there is no possibility of ascending the steep mountain face, or of escaping by sea against that terrible current. We continued upon this dismal shore for many weeks in a state of growing despair, expecting death every day. At first, we divided our meager provisions as equally as we could, and thus everyone lived a longer or shorter time, according to his temperance and the use he made of his share. But one by one, my companions succumbed to hunger and sickness. I survived all my companions, watching them die one by one with a heavy heart. I performed the last sad duty of burying them in the sand as best I could. When I buried the last one, I had so little provision remaining, just a few dried dates and hard biscuits, that I thought I could not long endure. I dug a grave for myself next to my comrades, resolving to lie down in it when my time came, because there was no one left to inter me. But it pleased God once more to take compassion on me, and when all hope seemed lost, He put an idea into my mind. I went to the bank of the strange river which ran from the sea into the great cavern. I sat there for a long time, watching the water flow into the darkness. Considering its probable course with great attention, I said to myself, "This river, which runs thus underground, must somewhere have an issue. It cannot simply disappear into the earth. If I make a raft and trust myself to the current, it will convey me to some inhabited country where the river emerges, or I shall perish in the attempt. If I be drowned in the cavern, I lose nothing, but only change one kind of lingering death for a quicker one. It is better to try and fail than to sit here and wait for the end." Driven by this new hope, I immediately went to work. The beach was littered with large pieces of timber and stout cables from the many wrecks. I selected the best of them and tied them together so strongly and carefully that I soon made a very solid and a stable raft. When I had finished its construction, I thought that if I were to escape, I should not go empty-handed. I gathered up as many riches as the raft could safely hold. I loaded it with large rubies, emeralds, and other precious stones that I picked up from the beach. I added sacks of valuable ambergris, chunks of rock crystal, and bales of rich stuffs that had survived the sea. Having balanced my precious cargo exactly and fastened it well to the raft so nothing would shift, I went on board with 2 rude oars that I had fashioned. I pushed the raft into the current of the river. As it caught the stream, I said a prayer, leaving it to the course of the river, and resigned myself to the will of God. As soon as the raft entered the cavern, I lost all light. The change from the bright sunlight to total darkness was terrifying. The stream carried me I knew not whither. The air was cold and damp, filled with the sound of rushing water echoing off unseen walls. Thus, I floated for what seemed like days in perfect darkness. I could see nothing, only feel the movement of the raft and hear the water. Once, I felt a gust of air from above and realized the arch of the cavern was so low that it very nearly touched my head. I flattened myself against the bales, making myself as small as possible, and was cautious afterward to avoid the like danger, lying flat whenever the sound of the water changed. All this while, I ate nothing but what was just necessary to support nature from my dwindling supplies. Yet, notwithstanding my frugality, all my provisions were eventually spent. I was enveloped in darkness, hunger, and uncertainty. Then a pleasing stupor seized upon me, a kind of sleep born of exhaustion and sensory deprivation. I cannot tell how long it continued. It might have been hours or days. But when I revived, I was surprised to find myself in a completely different world. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the sudden light. I was in an extensive, verdant plain on the brink of a broad river where my raft was tied to a stake on the bank. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and I was surrounded by a great number of people. They were dark-skinned, dressed in simple tunics, and were looking at me with friendly curiosity. I got up as soon as I saw them, though I was weak and unsteady. I saluted them in the customary manner. They spoke to me in return, but I did not understand their language. I was so transported with joy at being back in the world of living men that I knew not whether I was asleep or awake. Being persuaded that I was not asleep and overcome with emotion, I recited aloud the following words in Arabic, a prayer of thanksgiving. Call upon the Almighty, He will help thee. Thou needest not perplex thyself about anything else. Shut thy eyes, and while thou art asleep, God will change thy bad fortune into good. One of the men, who understood Arabic, hearing me speak thus, came toward me with a smile and said, Brother, be not surprised to see us. We are inhabitants of this country, and came hither today to water our fields from this river. We observed something floating upon the water, and perceiving your raft, one of us swam into the river and brought it hither, where we fastened it, as you see, until you should awake. Pray tell us your history, for it must be extraordinary. How did you venture yourself into this river, which comes from beneath the great mountain, and whence did you come? I was faint with hunger. I begged of them first to give me something to eat, and then I would satisfy their curiosity. They hastened to bring me several sorts of food, fresh fruits, bread, and dried fish. I ate with an appetite I had not felt in months. When I had satisfied my hunger and regained some strength, I related to them all that had befallen me, the shipwreck, the island of treasures and bones, the death of my companions, and my desperate journey through the subterranean river. They listened to my story with attentive surprise, exchanging amazed glances. As soon as I had finished, they told me through the interpreter that it was one of the most wonderful stories they had ever heard, and that I must go along with them and tell it to their king myself, it being too extraordinary to be related by any other than the person to whom the events had happened. I readily agreed. They immediately sent for a horse, which was brought in a little time from a nearby village. Having helped me to mount, some of them walked before to show the way, while the rest took my raft and its precious cargo and followed behind. We marched for some hours through a beautiful, fertile landscape until we came to a large and magnificent city. It was the capital of Serendib, for it was in that famous island I had landed, the river having carried me right under the mountains to the other side. My escort presented me to their king. He was a majestic figure seated on a grand throne. I approached him and saluted him as I used to do the kings of the Indies. That is to say, I prostrated myself at his feet and kissed the ground before him. The prince ordered me to rise, received me with an obliging air, and made me sit down near him on a cushion. He asked me my name and where I was from. I told him I was Sinbad the sailor, a merchant of Baghdad. Then I related to the king all that I have told you, omitting no detail of my suffering or my miraculous escape. His Majesty was so surprised and pleased with my narrative that he commanded my adventures to be written in letters of gold by his royal scribes and laid up in the archives of his kingdom for future generations to read. At last my raft was brought into the palace courtyard, and the bales were opened in his presence. He admired the quantity of fine wood of aloes and ambergris, but above all the rubies and emeralds took his breath away, for he had none in his treasury that equaled them in size or brilliance. Observing that he looked on my jewels with such pleasure, I fell prostrate at his feet again, and took the liberty to say to him, Sir, not only my person is at your Majesty's service, but the cargo of the raft, which I owe to my escape into your lands. I would beg of you to dispose of it as your own, as a token of my gratitude. He answered me with a benevolent smile, Sinbad, I will take care not to covet anything of yours, or to take anything from you that God has given you through such hardship. Far from lessening your wealth, I design to augment it, and will not let you quit my dominions without marks of my liberality. He then charged one of his high officers to take special care of me, and ordered people to serve me at his own expense. The officer was very faithful in the execution of his commission and caused all my goods to be carried to fine lodgings provided for me near the palace. I lived in the capital of Serendib for some time, enjoying the king's hospitality. I went every day at a set hour to make my court to the king, and spent the rest of my time in viewing the city and what was most worthy of notice in this remarkable land. The capital of Serendib stands at the end of a fine fertile valley in the middle of the island, encompassed by mountains the highest in the world, whose peaks are often hidden in the clouds. Rubies and several sorts of minerals abound in these mountains, and the rocks are for the most part composed of a metalline stone made use of to cut and polish other precious stones. All kinds of rare plants and trees grow there, especially vast forests of cedars and coconut trees. There is also a rich pearl fishing industry in the mouth of its principal river, and in some of its valleys are found diamonds. As a devout man, I made, by way of devotion, a pilgrimage to the place on the high mountain, which tradition says became the dwelling of Adam after his banishment from paradise. I had the curiosity to go to the very top of the mountain, a difficult ascent, to see the sacred spot. After some months, when I had seen all the wonders of the island and recovered fully from my ordeals, I felt a longing for my home. When I returned to the city from my pilgrimage, I prayed the king to allow me to return to my own country, and he granted me permission in the most honorable manner. He would needs force a rich present upon me from his own treasury to add to the wealth I had brought on my raft. And when I went to take my leave of him, he gave me another present much more considerable than the first, and at the same time charged me with a letter for the commander of the faithful, our sovereign, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, saying to me, I pray you give this present from me and this letter to the Caliph, and assure him of my friendship and high regard. I took the present and letter with great honor and promised His Majesty punctually to execute the commission with which he was pleased to honor me. The letter from the king of Serendib was written on the skin of a certain animal of great value because of its being so scarce, and was of a fine yellowish color. The characters of this letter were written in beautiful azure blue ink, and the contents were as follows. The King of the Indies, before whom march 100 elephants in procession, who lives in a palace that shines with 100,000 rubies, and who has in his treasury 20,000 crowns enriched with diamonds, to Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Though the present we send you be inconsiderable in comparison to your greatness, receive it, however, as a brother, in consideration of the hearty friendship which we bear for you, and of which we are willing to give you proof. We desire the same part in your friendship, considering that we believe it to be our merit, being of the same dignity with yourself. We conjure you this in quality of a brother. Adieu. The present that accompanied this letter consisted of several magnificent items. First, there was one single ruby made into a cup about half a foot high, an inch thick, and filled to the brim with round pearls of half a drachm each. Second, the skin of a rare serpent, whose scales were as large as an ordinary piece of gold, and had the miraculous virtue to preserve from sickness those who lay upon it. Third, 50,000 drachms of the best, most fragrant wood of aloes, with 30 grains of pure camphire as big as pistachios. And fourth, a beautiful female slave, an accomplished musician and singer, whose apparel was all covered over with precious jewels. I embarked on a fine ship provided by the king, which was bound for the Persian Gulf. The ship set sail, and after a very successful and peaceful navigation, we landed at Bussorah. From thence I went with a caravan to Baghdad, where my first concern was to acquit myself of the commission I had undertaken. I took the king of Serendib's letter and the magnificent presents and went to present myself at the gate of the palace of the commander of the faithful, followed by the beautiful slave and such of my own servants as carried the other gifts. I stated the reason of my coming to the guards and was immediately conducted to the throne room of the caliph. I made my reverence, prostrating myself, and after a short speech explaining my mission, I gave him the letter and the presents. The caliph examined the gifts with great admiration. When he had read what the king of Serendib wrote to him, he asked me with great interest if the prince were really so rich and potent as he represented himself in his letter. I prostrated myself a second time, and rising again, said, Commander of the faithful, I can assure your majesty he doth not exceed the truth. I have seen his state with my own eyes. Nothing is more worthy of admiration than the magnificence of his palace. When the prince appears in public, He has a throne fixed on the back of a huge elephant and marches betwixt two ranks of his ministers, favorites, and other people of his court. Before him, upon the same elephant, an officer carries a golden lance in his hand, and behind the throne there is another officer who stands upright with a column of gold on the top of which is an emerald 1/2 foot long and an inch thick. Before him march a guard of 1,000 men, clad in cloth of gold and silk, and mounted on elephants richly caparisoned. While the king is on his march, the officer who is before him on the same elephant cries from time to time with a loud voice for all to hear, "Behold the great monarch, the potent and redoubtable Sultan of the Indies, whose palace is covered with 100,000 rubies, and who possesses 20,000 crowns of diamonds. Behold the monarch greater than Solomon, and the powerful Maharaja." After he has pronounced those words, the officer behind the throne cries in his turn to remind the king and the people of humility. This monarch, so great and so powerful, must die, must die, must die. And the officer before replies, "Praise be to him who liveth forever." Furthermore, the king of Serendib is so just and wise that there are no judges in his dominions. His people have no need of them. They understand and observe justice rigidly of themselves, following his noble example. The caliph was much pleased with my account. "The wisdom of that king," said he, "appears in his letter, and after what you tell me, I must confess that his wisdom is worthy of his people, and his people deserve so wise a prince." Having spoken thus, he dismissed me with great honor and sent me home with a rich present from his own treasury in recognition of my services as an ambassador. Sinbad here left off the relation of his sixth voyage. His company, including the porter Sinbad, who had listened with rapt attention, retired. Sinbad received his customary 100 sequins, and next day they all returned to hear the relation of his seventh and last voyage.